Somewhere in the western suburbs of every Australian city, there is a fibro house. You know the one. Low-set, modest, sun-bleached walls of asbestos cement. A corrugated roof that rattles in the summer wind. A house built for a returned soldier or a factory worker or a young family who needed something solid and affordable and quick. Tens of thousands of them went up in the decade after the Second World War, lining the streets of Wentworthville and Sunshine and Elizabeth and Broadmeadows and 100 towns in between. They were the physical proof that Australia was building itself into something, that ordinary people had earned the right to own a piece of it. The material that built them was called fibro. The company that made it was called James Hardie. For 70 years, James Hardie manufactured asbestos cement products in factories across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia. Its products were woven into the walls and roofs and pipes of the nation. Its headquarters in Sydney bore a name that seemed, at the time, entirely unremarkable: Asbestos House. On the 21st of September 2004, a 1,000-page report landed on the desks of the New South Wales government. It confirmed what the dying already knew. So here is the question this story cannot escape. How long can a company know it is killing people and choose to keep going? In 1888, a 36-year-old Scotsman named James Hardie stepped off a ship in Melbourne with no particular fortune and no obvious plan beyond the conviction that Australia was a place where a man with commercial instincts could make something of himself. He had come from Linlithgow, a small town west of Edinburgh, where his family ran a tannery. He knew about trade, he knew about materials, and he knew that a young colony on the other side of the world was hungry for both. He set up a modest import business, animal oils, industrial chemicals, the practical cargo of a growing economy. It was unglamorous work, but it was steady. And then, in 1892, a fellow Scotsman arrived in Melbourne. His name was Andrew Reid. He had known Hardie back in the old country, and he came to join the business, becoming a full partner by 1895. Where Hardie was measured and cautious, Reid was energetic and visionary. The two men balanced each other well, and the business grew. It might have remained a modest trading house indefinitely. But in 1903, James Hardie travelled to London on a buying trip and encountered something he had never seen before. It was called fibro cement, a composite material invented in France, combining asbestos fibre with Portland cement to produce thin, flat sheets that were strong, lightweight, fireproof, and easy to transport. The French had been using it for roofing and lining slate. Hardie immediately grasped its potential in a country like Australia, where the climate was harsh, building materials were expensive, and the demand for affordable housing was only going to grow. He began importing it. The product sold well from the start. Under the brand name Fibrolite, it found a ready market among builders, local councils, and owner-occupiers looking for something durable that would not break the bank. When James Hardie retired in 1911, selling his half of the business to Andrew Reid for £17,000, the company that still bore his name was already a significant presence in the Australian building materials market. Then the First World War arrived and changed everything. Imports from Europe became impossible. The supply of Fibrolite dried up overnight. Andrew Reid faced a choice: watch the business contract or find a way to make the product himself. He chose the latter. Machinery was imported to establish local production, and by 1917, the same year young Australian men were dying in the mud of Passchendaele, the first James Hardie manufacturing plant opened at Camellia, in the industrial heart of Sydney's west, on the banks of the Parramatta River. It was a practical decision made under pressure. No one involved could have imagined what that factory and the material it produced would eventually mean. The timing was fortunate in ways that had nothing to do with the war. Australia in the 1920s and 1930s was a country with an insatiable appetite for cheap, fast, durable building materials. The population was growing. Workers were moving to the cities. The old timber cottages of the colonial era were being replaced. And fibro, lightweight, fireproof, easy to cut and nail, impervious to white ants, cheap enough for a labourer's wage, seemed almost perfectly designed for the Australian condition. By the 1930s, James Hardie had expanded its operations, opened new facilities, and established itself as the dominant force in the fibro cement market. The Reed family continued to lead the company through the Depression years, when fibro's low cost made it the only building material that thousands of families could afford. Whole streets of small fibro cottages went up in the outer suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. Modest, functional homes that represented genuine achievement for the people who built and bought them. What those people did not know, what almost no one in Australia knew, was that the fibre at the heart of every sheet of fibrillite was one of the most dangerous substances on Earth. The asbestos fibres were microscopic, invisible. They floated in the air of the factory and settled on the skin and clothes of the workers who handled them. Breathed in, they lodged in the lining of the lungs and stayed there, for years, for decades, doing their slow, silent work. The diseases they caused, asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma, did not appear until 20, 30, sometimes 40 years after exposure. By the time the symptoms arrived, the damage had long been done. In 1917, none of this was understood publicly. The science was still forming. The death toll had not yet begun to accumulate. And so the factory at Camellia opened its doors. The machines ran and the dust rose. Australia was building itself a future. It just did not know what the foundations were made of. In the decade after the Second World War, Australia embarked on the greatest building program in its history. The soldiers had come home. The factories that had made munitions were retooling for peacetime. The federal government, determined to house a generation of returned servicemen and their young families, unleashed a wave of construction that transformed the outer edges of every major city in the country. The Housing Commission of New South Wales, the Housing Commission of Victoria, the South Australian Housing Trust. They carved new suburbs out of paddocks and bushland, laid down streets where there had been nothing, and built thousands upon thousands of small, solid homes for people who had never owned property before and never expected to. And they built them out of fibro. James Hardie's timing was, by any measure, extraordinary. The company had spent 3 decades building its manufacturing capacity, its distribution network, and its brand recognition across the country. Now, just as the greatest peacetime demand for building materials in Australian history arrived, James Hardie was positioned to meet it almost entirely on its own terms. The fibro cement sheets came off the line at Camellia and were loaded onto trucks and trains and shipped to building sites from Cairns to Kalgoorlie. Hardie's Super 6, the company's signature corrugated roofing sheet, became, in the words of one later historian, the Great Australian Roof. If you grew up in the suburbs of any Australian city between 1945 and 1975, the odds were considerable that you lived under one. By the mid-1950s, Australia had become the 4th largest consumer of fibro in the world. By the mid-1960s, fibro featured in roughly 20% of all Australian housing stock. State housing authorities built entire suburbs of it, in Broadmeadows and Sunshine in Victoria, in Elizabeth and Salisbury in South Australia, in Inala and Oxley in Queensland, in the sprawling western suburbs of Sydney that stretched out beyond Parramatta toward the Blue Mountains. These were not the suburbs of the wealthy. They were the suburbs of factory workers and bus drivers and shop assistants and returned soldiers, people for whom a fibro house was not a compromise but an achievement, a stake in the country they had helped to build. The advertising from James Hardie during these years was confident to the point of celebration. Fibro was marketed as fireproof, durable, resistant to termites, suited to the Australian climate in ways that older materials simply were not. The slogan, "The miracle fibre of the 20th century," appeared in newspapers and hardware catalogues and building industry journals across the country. There was nothing understated about it. James Hardie knew what it had, and it sold it accordingly. Inside the factories, the picture was less triumphant. At Camellia, on the western edge of inner Sydney, the day began before 6 in the morning. Workers in blue factory shirts and steel-cap boots filed in through the gates, signed on, and took their positions along the production line. The air inside the plant was thick with white dust, fine particles of asbestos fibre that rose from the mixing vats and the cutting machines and hung in the atmosphere like a permanent low fog. Workers called themselves the snowmen, not as a joke exactly, but as a statement of fact. By smoko, their hair was white, their eyebrows were white. The dust settled on their skin and into their lungs with every breath they took. There were no respirators. There were no sealed enclosures around the mixing equipment. There was no industrial ventilation system designed to capture and remove airborne fibre. The technology to do these things existed. Other industries in other countries were beginning to implement it. But at Camellia and at James Hardie's factories in Victoria, Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia, the line ran as it always had. The dust was simply part of the job. Bernie Banton arrived at Camellia in 1968. He was a young man from the western suburbs, and his older brother Ted had helped him get the position. He worked as a lathe operator, shaping blocks of asbestos insulation for use in power stations, machining pipe sections that would be installed in industrial facilities across New South Wales. The dust was constant. It coated his face, his arms, his work clothes. At the end of a shift, he and his workmates would use compressed air hoses to blow the worst of it off before heading home. It did not occur to anyone to ask whether that was sufficient. The company had not suggested there was any reason to worry. Beyond the factory gates, the web of James Hardie's operations extended far from Camellia. In the remote country of northern New South Wales, near the small township of Barrialgill in the Clarence Valley, the company operated an open-cut asbestos mine. The workforce was drawn largely from the local Aboriginal community, the Bundjalung people, who had been relocated to the area by government decree decades earlier, and now found that the only reliable employment available to them was underground and in the dust. The conditions at Barrialgill were, by any measure, severe. The white asbestos dust hung in the open air of the mine and drifted through the community. Children played in it. Women washed their husbands' dust-covered work clothes by hand. The mine operated without meaningful dust controls, without adequate health monitoring, and without any serious effort to inform the workforce of the risks they were absorbing with every breath. Back in Sydney, on the 11th floor of a building in York Street in the Central Business District, the company's executives worked in offices lined with fibrillite sheeting. The building's formal name, used without embarrassment, printed on the company letterhead displayed above the front entrance, was Asbestos House. The company itself, listed on the Sydney Stock Exchange since 1951, carried the name James Hardie Asbestos on its official documents. This was not considered remarkable. Asbestos was, after all, what the company made. It was the foundation of everything. It was also, by this point, something else entirely. Because while James Hardie was building its empire of fibro roofing and asbestos pipe insulation and brake linings and industrial lagging, the scientific evidence about what asbestos did to human lungs had been quietly accumulating for decades. A British pathologist had documented asbestosis, scarring of the lung tissue, as early as the 1930s. In 1960, a South African researcher named Christopher Wagner published a landmark paper identifying mesothelioma, a cancer of the lining of the lung and abdomen, almost exclusively associated with asbestos exposure, almost universally fatal, and capable of lying dormant for 30 or 40 years before appearing. The paper caused serious concern among occupational health researchers in Britain and the United States. In Australia, inside the offices of James Hardie, it caused something rather different. It caused a paper trail, internal memos, management discussions, correspondence between senior executives, that would eventually find its way into the hands of lawyers and judges and a Royal Commission-level inquiry. Documents that showed, without ambiguity, that the highest levels of the company were aware that asbestos posed a serious risk to the health of the people who worked with it. Documents that showed the company chose to continue anyway. The snowmen at Camellia kept working, the dust kept rising, and the Great Australian Roof kept going up, suburb by suburb, street by street, across the whole of the country. What no one standing on those streets in 1965 could have known was that the crisis had already begun. It was just taking its time to arrive. The question that would eventually consume a 1,000-page government inquiry, dozens of court proceedings, and 20 years of legal and political battle was deceptively simple. When did James Hardie know? The answer, as it turned out, was far earlier than the company ever admitted. And the gap between what the company knew and what it chose to do with that knowledge is where the real story of James Hardie begins. Inside the company's own files, documents that would later be tendered as evidence in the Dust Diseases Tribunal of New South Wales, there existed a memo written by a James Hardie safety officer sometime in the 1940s. The memo warned senior management, in plain and unambiguous language, that asbestos dust was among the most dangerous industrial poisons known to science. It described the risk of lung disease among workers exposed to the fibre. It recommended that something be done. The memo was received, it was read, and the factory kept running exactly as it had before. This was not ignorance, this was a choice. By the time that memo was written, the scientific literature on asbestos and lung disease was already decades old. British researchers had documented asbestosis, the progressive scarring of lung tissue caused by inhaled asbestos fibre, since the 1930s. The British government had introduced workplace regulations limiting dust exposure as early as 1931, following an official inquiry that found widespread asbestos disease in British factories. The death toll in the United Kingdom was already being counted. In the United States, insurance companies had begun declining to cover asbestos workers in the late 1920s because the actuarial risk was too clear to ignore. James Hardie knew all of this. The company had commercial relationships with asbestos manufacturers in Britain. Its executives travelled internationally. The information was not hidden, it was simply inconvenient. Through the 1950s, the scientific case against asbestos continued to harden. In 1955, a British epidemiologist published a study definitively linking asbestos exposure to lung cancer. In 1960, Christopher Wagner's landmark paper on mesothelioma, that rare and savage cancer of the lung lining, almost invariably caused by asbestos, almost invariably fatal within months of diagnosis, landed in the medical literature with the force of a verdict. By the early 1960s, the connection between asbestos and fatal disease was not a hypothesis. It was established science. At James Hardie's head office in Asbestos House, the response to this accumulating evidence was deliberate and consistent. The company monitored the international literature carefully. Its legal and medical advisors were well briefed. And when the question of adverse publicity arose, specifically the growing coverage of asbestos disease in the British press, the company's chairman and senior personnel discussed not how to protect their workers, but how to manage the optics. In correspondence later tendered before the courts, company chairman John Reid and the company's personnel manager exchanged communications about the British publicity. The concern was not for the men on the factory floor. The concern was for the company's reputation and its legal exposure. Strategies were discussed. A posture of measured denial was adopted. The dust kept rising at Camellia. In Australia, the regulatory environment offered James Hardie considerable shelter. Unlike Britain, which had imposed dust exposure limits in 1931, Australian workplace authorities were slow to move. The culture of the factory floor in post-war Australia was not one where workers asked questions about the long-term health effects of their work. You signed on, you did the job, you went home. The union movement was strong in some industries, but occupational health science was not yet the force it would become. And mesothelioma, with its latency period of 20 to 40 years, was not yet visible. The men who would die from the dust they breathed at Camellia in the 1950s and 1960s were not yet sick. They were still on the tools, still collecting their pay packets, still having a beer at knock-off time. The company understood this latency period better than anyone. It was, in a grim sense, part of the business model's comfort. The consequences were so far in the future that they could always be someone else's problem. In 1967, Australia took a partial step, banning the use of crocodolite, blue asbestos, the most immediately lethal variety, in new products. James Hardie had primarily used chrysotile, white asbestos, and amosite, brown asbestos, so the ban did not materially affect its operations. Production continued, the factories ran, and quietly, carefully, the company began settling the occasional compensation claim that arrived through the courts, settling out of court, under confidentiality agreements, so that no precedent would be established and no public record would accumulate. This pattern of private settlement was not accidental. It was strategic. Every case that was resolved quietly behind closed doors was a case that did not produce a judgment, did not create a legal precedent, and did not generate a newspaper story. The company's legal team understood that a flood of litigation was coming. The actuarial analysis was not difficult, and the strategy was to delay, contain, and minimise for as long as possible. In 1978, more than 60 years after the factory at Camellia first opened, James Hardie finally began attaching warning labels to its products. The labels advised that inhaling dust from the products could cause cancer. They appeared on packaging for materials that had been on the market, without warning, since the First World War. The company would later point to the introduction of these labels as evidence of its responsible approach to worker and consumer safety. It was, in truth, evidence of the opposite. By 1978, the science had been settled for nearly 2 decades. Multi-million-dollar compensation awards had already been made to asbestos victims in courts in the United States. The death toll among former asbestos workers in Britain had been climbing for years, and James Hardie, the company that had spent more than half a century filling the lungs of its workers, its customers, and the residents of fibro houses across the country with asbestos fibre, had spent all of that time selling the material without a word of caution. The labels arrived 60 years too late, but they were revealing in a different way, because their appearance in 1978 marks the moment when the company's long era of comfortable denial began to give way to something more urgent. The lawsuits were no longer occasional, the victims were no longer invisible, and within the walls of Asbestos House the mood was shifting, not toward remorse but toward damage control. At what point does a company's knowledge of harm become complicity in it? The answer for James Hardie had arrived decades before anyone forced them to confront it. The question now was what they intended to do. By the late 1970s, the men who had worked at Camellia in the 1950s and 1960s were beginning to get sick. It happened the way mesothelioma always happens, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. A persistent cough, shortness of breath on the stairs, a visit to the doctor that led to another visit, and then a chest x-ray, and then the kind of conversation that no one in a Western Sydney suburb in 1979 had ever expected to have. The disease had a name that most people could barely pronounce, and a prognosis that left no room for ambiguity. Once mesothelioma appeared, death typically followed within months. There was no treatment, there was no recovery, there was only the brutal compression of whatever time remained. The latency period, that long, silent gap between exposure and illness, meant that the wave of disease arriving in the late 1970s and early 1980s was the direct consequence of what had happened on the factory floor 20 and 30 years earlier. The men now dying had breathed the dust as young workers in their 20s and 30s when they had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. They had gone home to their fibro houses in Wentworthville and Pendle Hill and Toongabbie and raised their families and lived their lives. And now, in middle age, the dust they had carried in their lungs for decades was collecting its debt. James Hardie's response to this emerging crisis was not compassion. It was litigation management. The company's legal strategy in the late 1970s and through the 1980s was built on a single foundational principle: never let a case go to judgment if it could be settled out of court. Every worker or family member who brought a claim was met with a team of company lawyers whose primary objective was to resolve the matter privately, quickly, and under a confidentiality agreement. The settlements were not generous, they were calculated to be just sufficient to make the claim go away. And because each settlement was sealed, no body of public evidence accumulated. No precedent was established. The company's exposure remained officially invisible. This was not a passive strategy. It required active monitoring of every claim filed against the company in every state jurisdiction. It required coordination between legal teams across multiple subsidiaries. And it required a consistent public posture, maintained by executives, public affairs staff, and the company's representatives in any forum where the question arose, that James Hardie had at all times acted responsibly, with the best available knowledge, and in the interests of its workers. Peter MacDonald, who would later rise to become chief executive of the company, articulated this posture with characteristic precision. The company, he maintained, had operated at all times with the best of intentions and with the best of knowledge. It was a formulation carefully designed to be difficult to disprove and impossible to accept. Because the internal documents, the memos, the correspondence, the legal analyses, told a different story entirely. And those documents existed. They had not been destroyed. They were sitting in filing cabinets, waiting. In March 1987, James Hardie announced that it was ceasing all asbestos manufacturing activities. The decision was presented publicly as a response to growing community concern about asbestos safety. In reality, the timing had less to do with moral reckoning than with market conditions. By the mid-1980s, demand for fibro was declining sharply. Brick veneer homes had become the aspirational choice for Australian families, and fibro's association with public housing and working-class suburbs was now a commercial liability as much as a health one. More importantly, James Hardie had spent the preceding decade developing asbestos-free fibre cement technology, and that technology was now ready for market. The asbestos product lines were being retired not because the company had experienced a change of heart, but because they were no longer profitable enough to justify the mounting legal risk. In the same year the company stopped making asbestos products, it also began rebranding. The name James Hardie Asbestos had already been quietly dropped in 1979, replaced simply by James Hardie, and now the company began presenting itself as a forward-looking building materials innovator, focused on new generation fibre cement and international growth. The asbestos era in the company's preferred narrative was simply a chapter of history that had now closed. For the workers who had breathed the dust, the chapter had not closed at all. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the death toll continued to climb. The latency period meant that the consequences of exposure from the 1960s and 1970s were still arriving, year after year. Men who had worked at Camellia, at Hardie's plants in Clayton and Welshpool and Riverview, at the Barrialgill mine, were dying from diseases caused by a substance they had been given no meaningful warning about and no protection from. Their wives, who had washed their dust-covered work clothes for years, sometimes decades, were getting sick too. Their children, who had grown up in fibro houses and played in the dust of their father's work clothes, were getting sick. The web of exposure was far wider than the factory floor, and the company's legal liability was beginning to look not like a manageable problem, but like an existential one. In 1995, the Reed family's long dominance of James Hardie came to an end. After 84 years of family leadership, from Andrew Reed's takeover in 1911 through to his grandson's generation, the company passed to professional management. Peter MacDonald became chief executive. He inherited a company that was profitable, that was growing internationally, and that was carrying a burden of asbestos liability that no one had yet been able to fully quantify because the wave of disease had not yet reached its peak, and the full scale of what was coming was not yet visible in the actuarial projections. MacDonald commissioned the analysis that would make it visible. He brought in actuaries and legal advisors and asked them to model the total future liability, every expected claim, in every jurisdiction, over every remaining year of the latency period. The number they produced was not published. It was kept within the company. But it was large enough to make clear that the existing approach, settling cases quietly as they arrived, was no longer sustainable. Something more decisive was required. Between 1995 and 2000, James Hardie began a careful, methodical process of restructuring its corporate architecture. The two subsidiaries that carried virtually all of the company's asbestos liabilities, James Hardie and Coy, and Hardie Ferodo, later renamed Amarca and Amaba respectively, were progressively stripped of assets. Real estate holdings were transferred. Profitable operations were moved to other parts of the corporate structure. What remained in Amarca and Amaba was the liability, the mountains of potential asbestos claims, without the assets needed to pay them. This was not accidental, it was engineering. The plan that Peter MacDonald and his advisors were constructing was elegant in its corporate logic and devastating in its human consequences. If the asbestos liabilities could be separated from the rest of the James Hardie Group, quarantined in dedicated subsidiaries with limited assets, then cut loose from the parent company entirely, the main group could proceed with its international expansion plans, its New York Stock Exchange listing ambitions, and its transformation into a global fibre cement business, free of the drag of an Australian asbestos legacy that had no foreseeable end. The victims in this architecture became a line item, a problem to be managed at arm's length, a liability to be contained rather than a human consequence to be honoured. No one said any of this out loud. The documents that described what was being planned used the careful, neutral language of corporate restructuring. But the destination was unmistakable, and by the time the plan was ready to execute, it had been refined to a degree of precision that spoke to months, perhaps years, of deliberate preparation. The machinery of betrayal was almost complete. All that remained was the announcement. On the 16th of February, 2001, Peter MacDonald stood before a room of journalists and financial analysts in Sydney and made an announcement that would, 3 years later, be described by a government inquiry as one of the most consequential acts of corporate deception in Australian history. James Hardie, he explained, had established a new foundation, the Medical Research and Compensation Foundation, or MRCF, to take over responsibility for all asbestos compensation claims against the company's former subsidiaries. The foundation had been endowed with $293 million in assets. It was, MacDonald assured the room, fully funded. It had sufficient resources to meet every legitimate compensation claim that could reasonably be anticipated over the remaining life of the asbestos liability. James Hardie's obligations to its former workers and their families had been honoured. The matter was resolved. At the same time, the company had applied to the New South Wales Supreme Court for permission to restructure its corporate architecture, separating Amaka and Amaba, the two subsidiaries carrying the asbestos liabilities, from the James Hardie Group, and to relocate its head office to the Netherlands. The restructuring was approved, the relocation proceeded, and the company that had spent 70 years manufacturing asbestos products in Australia quietly moved its legal domicile to a country on the other side of the world. The Netherlands was not chosen at random. It was, at the time, one of only 2 countries in the world with which Australia did not have a treaty for the mutual enforcement of civil court judgments. If an Australian court awarded damages to an asbestos victim and ordered James Hardie to pay, enforcing that order against a Netherlands-domiciled company would be, as a practical matter, extraordinarily difficult. The choice of jurisdiction was not a coincidence of corporate preference. It was a legal firewall. In Sydney, the building at 65 to 69 York Street, Asbestos House, as it had always been known, was vacated. James Hardie had occupied the building since the late 1920s, and its presence there had been, in its way, a kind of institutional honesty. The name on the building said exactly what the company was. Now the company was leaving, and the building would eventually be repurposed for other tenants who would know nothing of what had been decided within its walls. By March 2002, the offices were empty. The filing cabinets had been moved or removed. The name above the door meant nothing anymore. For a brief moment, the plan appeared to have worked. James Hardie's share price was healthy. The company's fibre cement operations in the United States were growing rapidly. The New York Stock Exchange listing that MacDonald had long pursued was within reach. The asbestos liability had been, in the preferred corporate terminology, ring-fenced, contained, managed. The new foundation would handle the claims. The company would move forward. Then the claims kept coming, and coming, and coming. The actuarial modelling that had been used to justify the $293 million endowment was, as a judge would later put it, wildly optimistic. It had underestimated the number of future claims, underestimated the average settlement value, and failed to adequately account for the long tail of the latency period, the fact that men and women who had been exposed to asbestos in the 1970s were still, in 2001, only partway through the window in which their disease would appear. The wave of mesothelioma deaths had not yet reached its peak. It would not peak until the early 2010s, and the $293 million that was supposed to last for the lifetime of the liability was going to run out within a few years. The MRCF's own administrators began to see this almost immediately. By 2002, the Foundation's financial projections were alarming. The gap between what it had and what it was going to need was not a rounding error. It was a chasm. The total liability, the realistic cost of compensating every future claimant, was being revised upward past $1 billion, toward $1.5 billion, toward $2 billion. Against that figure, $293 million was not a solution. It was a gesture. In March 2003, James Hardie took a further step that would, when it became public, produce a reaction of raw fury across the country. The company quietly cancelled an arrangement under which its former Australian subsidiaries could, if needed, call upon the parent company's assets to meet compensation claims. This cancellation, effectively severing the last financial lifeline between James Hardie and its asbestos victims, was not disclosed to the New South Wales Supreme Court, which had approved the original restructuring on the basis that such arrangements remained in place. It was not disclosed to the New South Wales government. It was not disclosed to the Australian Securities Exchange. It was done in silence on the other side of the world by a board sitting in the Netherlands. Later that year, the MRCF formally notified the New South Wales government that its funds were running out. The foundation had been set up, it explained, without adequate resources to meet its obligations. It was not going to be able to pay the people it had been established to compensate. James Hardie, when approached, declined to provide additional funding. For the people waiting for that compensation, the news was not abstract. Bernie Banton had been waiting for years. He had left Camellia in 1974, and the dust he had breathed during his 6 years on the factory floor had given him asbestosis, a progressive, incurable scarring of the lungs that required him, by the time the MRCF crisis became public, to carry a portable oxygen cylinder wherever he went. He had filed his first claim against James Hardie in 1999, becoming one of the first workers to pursue a provisional damages settlement through the Dust Diseases Tribunal of New South Wales. His older brother Ted had already died of mesothelioma. Of the 137 men Bernie had worked alongside at Camellia when he left in 1974, he knew of only 6 who were still alive by 2003. That year, the former Camellia workers held their annual Christmas reunion at the Wentworthville Leagues Club, as they had done for years on the first Friday of December. 2 people attended. The contrast between that gathering, 2 men in a leagues club surrounded by empty chairs, remembering colleagues who would never again fill them, and the boardroom in Amsterdam where James Hardie's directors were congratulating themselves on a successful corporate restructuring, is not the kind of contrast that requires editorial comment. It simply needs to be stated and allowed to sit. In December 2003, New South Wales Premier Bob Carr announced that his government was establishing a special commission of inquiry into the MRCF and the circumstances of its creation. The inquiry would be led by David Jackson QC, a former judge of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, and would have powers comparable to a royal commission. It could compel witnesses. It could demand documents. It could go wherever the evidence led. James Hardie's lawyers prepared their arguments. The company's public relations machinery began framing the narrative. Peter MacDonald reiterated through company spokespeople that the restructuring had been conducted in good faith, and that the MRCF had been established with the genuine intention of meeting the company's obligations. The filing cabinets, however, the ones that had been moved from Asbestos House when the company left in 2002, contained a different account entirely, and David Jackson QC was about to read every page of it. The Jackson inquiry opened in February 2004 and ran for nearly 200 hearing days. It was, by any measure, one of the most forensically thorough investigations ever conducted into the conduct of an Australian corporation. David Jackson QC and his team worked through mountains of internal documents, board minutes, legal memoranda, actuarial reports, correspondence between executives, notes from meetings that James Hardie had hoped would never become public. They called witnesses from every level of the company's hierarchy, former directors, former chief executives, company solicitors, actuaries, and financial advisors. They followed the paper trail from Camellia to Asbestos House to Amsterdam, reconstructing decision by decision the architecture of what had been done. What emerged over those 200 days was not a story of corporate mismanagement or honest miscalculation. It was a story of deliberate design. The inquiry found that the Medical Research and Compensation Foundation had been established not as a genuine attempt to honour James Hardie's obligations to its asbestos victims, but as a financial mechanism to separate the company from those obligations before relocating to the Netherlands. The $293 million endowment had been calculated not to meet the full liability, but to meet a deliberately optimistic projection of that liability, a projection that the company's own advisors had warned was insufficient, and whose inadequacy the board had reason to understand at the time the announcement was made. The February 2001 statement to the Australian Securities Exchange, the statement in which Peter MacDonald had assured investors, regulators, government and the public that the MRCF was fully funded and that James Hardie's asbestos obligations had been resolved, was the inquiry found false. It was not accidentally false. It was false in ways that reflected the board's awareness of information that contradicted the claims being made. And the decision to make that statement, and to make it in the form that it took, had involved the company's most senior executives and a majority of its board of directors. On the 21st of September 2004, David Jackson QC handed down his report. It ran to 2 volumes and nearly 1,000 pages. Its findings were precise, documented and damning. The reaction across Australia was immediate and visceral. Greg Combet, the Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, had been following the inquiry closely since its opening. He had spent months working with victim support groups, with lawyers acting for former James Hardie workers, and with state and federal politicians on both sides of the aisle who understood that what James Hardie had done was not merely a corporate governance failure, but a fundamental betrayal of the workers who had built the company's fortune. When the report was released, Combet did not reach for careful language. He called the relocation of the company's assets to the Netherlands and the deliberate underfunding of the Compensation Foundation what it was, one of the most disgusting corporate acts he had ever seen. The union movement mobilised with a speed and coherence that had not been seen on a single issue for years. The threat of Australia-wide bans on James Hardie products, bans that would be implemented by construction unions, transport workers and waterside workers, was placed squarely on the table. It was not an idle threat. The building industry unions had the organisational capacity to make such bans effective, and the membership had both the motivation and the moral clarity to enforce them. James Hardie's remaining Australian business, its fibre cement operations at Rosehill in New South Wales and Carroll Park in Queensland, would be brought to a standstill. The company's shareholders were not insulated from the pressure. A series of protests and information meetings were held across Australia in the weeks following the report's release. Australian institutional investors, superannuation funds, insurance companies, the managed funds that collectively held a significant portion of James Hardie's share register, were confronted directly with the question of whether they were comfortable holding shares in a company that had deliberately abandoned its obligations to dying workers. The answer, from a growing number of them, was that they were not. In Amsterdam, at the company's annual general meeting held in September 2004, Dutch shareholders found the meeting disrupted by Australian protesters and union representatives who had travelled to the Netherlands specifically to ensure that the company's international investor base understood what had been done in its name. The image of a group of Australians standing outside a corporate meeting room in Amsterdam, holding photographs of men dying of mesothelioma, was not the kind of publicity that any board of directors could easily absorb. Peter MacDonald resigned as chief executive in the weeks following the inquiry's report. The negotiations that followed were long, complex, and at times appeared in danger of collapsing entirely. Greg Combet led the union side of the discussions, working with the New South Wales government under Premier Bob Carr and later Morrissey Emma, and with James Hardie's new management, to construct a funding agreement that would actually meet the liability rather than gesture toward it. The legal architecture was complicated. The company was now domiciled in the Netherlands. Its assets were spread across multiple jurisdictions, and any agreement had to be enforceable against a board sitting in Amsterdam and shareholders voting in a European meeting room. In December 2004, a heads of agreement was signed, but the agreement was not final. The negotiations continued through 2005 and into 2006, tangled in the competing requirements of Australian, Dutch and United States law. There were moments when it appeared that the deal would not hold, that James Hardie would find a way to use the complexity of its international structure to reduce or delay its obligations still further. It did not. On the 7th of February 2007, James Hardie's shareholders voted in Amsterdam to approve a compensation package worth $4 billion to be paid to Australian asbestos victims over the following 40 years. It was, by any measure, a significant sum. It was also, for many of the people who had waited for it, too late. How does a company measure what it owes to the people it has already buried? Bernie Banton was not in Amsterdam when the vote was taken. He was in Sydney, managing his oxygen cylinder, attending medical appointments, and continuing, with a persistence that those who knew him described as both extraordinary and entirely characteristic, to advocate publicly for the rights of asbestos victims who had less capacity than he did to speak for themselves. In August 2007, his oncologist delivered a diagnosis that had always been the feared endpoint of his asbestos exposure: peritoneal mesothelioma, cancer of the lining of the abdomen, terminal, typically fatal within 6 months. He did not stop. In the final weeks of his life, gravely ill and confined to a bed at Concord Hospital in Sydney, Bernie Banton gave evidence in legal proceedings against a former James Hardie subsidiary. Proceedings related to his mesothelioma claim and a claim for exemplary damages reflecting the company's decades of knowing disregard for worker safety. He gave that evidence from his hospital bed. The company he was suing contested the proceedings. He died on the 27th of November 2007. He was 61 years old. The same week that Bernie Banton was buried, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission announced that it had commenced civil penalty proceedings against James Hardie's former directors and officers, including Peter MacDonald and former board chairwoman Meredith Hellicar, in relation to the February 2001 ASX statement. ASIC alleged that the directors had approved a statement they knew, or should have known, was false and misleading. The maximum penalty available was a fine and disqualification from managing a publicly listed company. In 2009, New South Wales Supreme Court Justice Ian Gazelle found that the directors had engaged in misleading conduct. Peter MacDonald was banned from managing a company for 15 years and fined $350,000. Meredith Hellicar and 6 other non-executive directors were banned for 5 years each and fined $30,000 apiece. Hellicar resigned from the boards of AMP and Amalgamated Holdings. Then, in December 2010, the New South Wales Court of Appeal overturned the findings against the non-executive directors on technical grounds, ruling that ASIC had not sufficiently proved the directors had passed a formal resolution approving the ASX statement at the relevant board meeting. The directors were free to return to corporate boardrooms. Hellicar's appeal against her own finding was also upheld. In 2012, the High Court of Australia, the country's final judicial authority, partially restored the original findings, reinstating penalties against some of the directors. The legal proceedings had run for nearly a decade, through 3 levels of court, and produced an outcome that satisfied almost no one. The fines were modest relative to the scale of what had been done. The disqualifications were time-limited. The men and women who had authorised or failed to prevent the events of 2001 were, in most cases, able to resume their careers in the corporate world. In Wentworthville, at the Leagues Club where the Camellia workers had once gathered every December, the reunions had long since stopped. There was no one left to attend. The compensation fund that Greg Combet negotiated and Bernie Banton died fighting for began paying claims in 2007. It was renamed the Asbestos Injuries Compensation Fund, and it operated under a structure designed to ensure that James Hardie's ongoing profits, generated now almost entirely from its fibre cement operations in the United States, would flow through to Australian victims for as long as the liability remained. The company was profitable. The fund was, on paper, secure, but the wave of disease had not stopped. Mesothelioma is not a crisis that announces itself and then recedes. It is a crisis that arrives slowly over decades, in accordance with the biology of a fibre that embeds itself in lung tissue and stays there, invisible and inert, until the day it is not. The men who had breathed asbestos dust at Camellia in the early 1970s, the last years of full production before the writing on the wall became impossible to ignore, were in 2007 only in their late 50s and early 60s. Their exposure window was not yet closed. The peak year for James Hardie mesothelioma claims in Australia according to modelling conducted for the Jackson Inquiry, was projected to fall somewhere around 2010 and 2011. After that, the toll would begin to decline, but slowly and over many years. Australia's relationship with asbestos had been, from the 1950s to the 1970s, more intense than almost any other country on Earth. The per capita consumption of asbestos during those decades was the highest in the world. The material had been used not just in factory settings, but in homes, in schools, in hospitals, in public buildings of every kind. It had been installed by tradesmen who breathed its dust without protection. It had been sanded and cut and drilled by homeowners conducting weekend renovations who had no idea what was in the wall they were working on. It had been disturbed by plumbers and electricians working in ceiling cavities lined with it decades earlier. The consequence of that exposure history was a death toll that, by any international comparison, was extraordinary. Australia held and continues to hold the second highest rate of mesothelioma deaths in the world, behind only the United Kingdom. More than 10,000 Australians had died of mesothelioma since the disease began to be systematically recorded in the early 1980s. The estimates for future deaths, accounting for all remaining exposure from the peak asbestos decades, ran to a further 25,000 or more over the coming decades. These were not factory workers alone. They were builders and plumbers and carpenters and teachers and the children of men who had come home from the camellia night shift with white dust on their clothes. They were the secondary and tertiary victims of a material that had been embedded into the physical fabric of the country and was still embedded there, in millions of ageing buildings waiting to be disturbed. The legal proceedings that followed the Jackson Inquiry did not bring this to an end. They established accountability of a kind, incomplete, contested, and in some cases subsequently overturned, but they could not undo the exposure. They could not restore the lung tissue. They could not return Bernie Banton's brother Ted, or the 131 men from Camellia who had not lived to see the inquiry's report. James Hardie Industries, meanwhile, continued to operate. It had relocated from the Netherlands to Ireland in 2010, and from Ireland its management eventually settled in Chicago, Illinois, where the company's executive team now sat, far removed, geographically and organisationally, from the factories at Camellia and Barrioulgill and the fibro suburbs of Western Sydney. The company's annual reports described its strategy for growing its fibre cement market share in North America and Asia Pacific. They did not dwell on the asbestos years. There was a legal and financial mechanism to handle those obligations. It operated. The company moved on. In Australia, the question of whether justice had been done remained genuinely contested. The $4 billion fund was real, and it paid real compensation to real people. But the structure of that compensation, tied to the profitability of a company now headquartered in the United States, subject to negotiation and revision as economic conditions changed, left victims and their advocates in a position of permanent contingency. When James Hardie's profits fell during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, the fund's payments were threatened. The advocates who had fought for the fund found themselves fighting again, this time not for its establishment, but for its maintenance. The battle that Greg Combet and Bernie Banton had waged was not, as it turned out, a battle that ended with a single victory. It was a battle that required ongoing vigilance, year after year, for as long as people were still dying. And people were still dying. The Barrioulgill community in northern New South Wales, the Aboriginal community that had provided James Hardie with its cheapest and most exposed workforce for decades, had received almost no attention in the national coverage of the James Hardie scandal. The Jackson Inquiry had focused primarily on the corporate governance failures of 2001 and the underfunding of the MRCF. The much older story of what had happened at the Barrioulgill mine, the decades of unprotected exposure inflicted on a community with no legal resources and no political voice, sat largely unexamined in the public record. The Bundjalung people of Barrioulgill carried a burden of asbestos disease that had never been fully counted and had never been fully compensated. In the broader community, the legacy of fibro was not abstract. There were, by conservative estimates, hundreds of thousands of fibro homes still standing across Australia, in the outer suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth, and in country towns from one end of the continent to the other. Many of them were ageing. Their sheeting was weathering, cracking, and in some cases crumbling. Home renovators working on these properties, sanding walls, removing roofing, cutting through internal lining, risked releasing asbestos fibre into the air of their own homes. State governments had introduced regulations requiring licensed asbestos removal for certain types of work, and public awareness campaigns had been run repeatedly over the years. But the scale of the problem was simply too large to be resolved by regulation alone. The fibro house was not a relic of the past. It was a present-day health risk, sitting quietly in the suburbs, waiting for a power sander or a demolition hammer to bring it back to life. In 2009, the year that James Hardie's directors were first found to have engaged in misleading conduct, and the same year that legal proceedings and appeals ensured that most of them would ultimately face limited consequences, Karen Banton, Bernie's widow, established the Bernie Banton Foundation. Its purpose was to support Australians living with asbestos-related diseases, to fund awareness and education programs, and to ensure that the people navigating the devastating experience of a mesothelioma diagnosis had access to information, advocacy, and specialist legal and medical support. The foundation operated for 11 years before voluntarily winding up in 2020, its founders concluding that the institutional landscape had changed enough, that enough awareness had been built and enough support infrastructure established, that the Foundation's specific mission had been substantially fulfilled. Bernie Banton had lived 61 years. He had spent the last 8 of them fighting a corporation that had employed him as a young man, given him no protection from the dust it knew was deadly, and then spent decades attempting to avoid accountability for what it had done. He had carried an oxygen cylinder to every meeting, every hearing, every press conference. He had given evidence from a hospital bed, dying, in proceedings against a company that was still contesting his claim. The foundation that bore his name had outlasted the corporation's attempts to be forgotten. That, at least, was something. There is a street in Wentworthville, in Sydney's western suburbs, that looks much as it did in 1965. The fibro houses are still there, modest, low-set, their walls a little more weathered than they once were, their corrugated roofs carrying the particular patina of decades of sun and rain. Some have been renovated, some have had brick extensions added at the back. Some still look exactly as they did when a young family moved in with second-hand furniture and a sense of genuine arrival. The feeling that they had made it, that this modest fibro box on a quiet suburban street represented something real and earned and permanent. The asbestos is still in the walls. This is the legacy that no corporate restructuring, no Netherlands relocation, no $4 billion compensation fund has been able to address. The material that James Hardie manufactured and sold across 70 years of Australian history did not disappear when the factories closed. It became the built environment. It is in the walls of houses and the roofs of sheds and the lining of ceiling cavities and the fences between backyards across the entire country. Conservative estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of fibro structures remain standing in Australia today. Each one is, under certain conditions, when disturbed, when cut, when sanded or demolished without proper precautions, a potential source of the fibre that has already killed tens of thousands of Australians and will kill tens of thousands more. The factory at Camellia does not commemorate this. The site on the banks of the Parramatta River where James Hardie first began manufacturing asbestos cement in 1917 is today an unremarkable stretch of industrial and commercial land. There is no plaque. There is no memorial to the workers who spent their careers breathing the dust that would eventually kill them. There is no acknowledgement in the physical landscape of the place that anything of historical significance happened here, that this patch of Western Sydney was the originating point of a public health catastrophe that is still, more than a century after the factory opened, claiming Australian lives. This absence is not accidental. It is the physical expression of a corporate culture that spent decades perfecting the art of not being remembered for the things it had done. James Hardie Industries today is a different company in almost every sense that matters legally and organisationally. It is headquartered in Chicago. It is listed on the New York Stock Exchange as well as the ASX. It manufactures asbestos-free fibre cement products. Its annual reports speak of innovation and sustainability and market leadership in the North American construction sector. The executives who designed the MRCF are gone, retired, disqualified or deceased. The shareholders who voted in Amsterdam in 2007 have been replaced by new shareholders who may know the history only in outline, if at all. The company carries the name James Hardie, but the institutional memory that the name once encoded has been systematically diluted by time, distance, and deliberate corporate reinvention. And yet the story refuses to stay buried. Gideon Hayes' Asbestos House, published in 2006, reconstructed the company's history with the precision of a forensic accountant and the narrative authority of a writer who understood that corporate malfeasance was not an abstract subject but a human one, a story about people who made choices and the people who paid for those choices with their lives. Matt Peacock's Killer Company, published in 2009, extended the account through the legal battles of the Bernie Banton era. The ABC miniseries Devil's Dust, broadcast in 2012, brought the story to a television audience that had not followed the inquiry transcripts or the court proceedings, dramatising the lives of former Camellia workers and their families with a directness that renewed public attention to what had happened and why it still mattered. These works did something that the Compensation Fund, for all its financial significance, could not do. They placed the story in the cultural record. They ensured that what James Hardie had done, and what it had tried to avoid doing, was not merely a chapter in a corporate governance textbook, but a part of the national understanding of how Australia had been built, and at what cost, and by whom. Because that is, finally, what the James Hardie story is about. Not the corporate restructuring of 2001, not the ASX statement, not the Netherlands relocation or the Dutch shareholders or the High Court proceedings. Those are the mechanisms. The story is about the workers at Camellia who were called snowmen because the white dust of asbestos covered them from head to foot every day of their working lives. It is about the Bundjalung people of Bariolgil who were given a choice between unemployment and a mine that was killing them, and who are still living with the consequences of that false choice today. It is about the women who washed their husbands' work clothes for years without knowing what was in the fabric, and who later developed mesothelioma from a domestic task so ordinary it barely registered as a risk. It is about the children who grew up in fibro houses and played in the dust of their father's clothes and are now, in late middle age, waiting to learn whether the latency period has run its course or whether it still has something left to deliver. It is about Bernie Banton carrying his oxygen cylinder through the corridors of the Dust Diseases Tribunal, outlasting, by sheer force of will and moral clarity, the lawyers and executives who had spent years hoping he would simply go away. James Hardie built the great Australian roof. It built the walls of the fibro suburbs. It built the pipes that ran beneath the factories and the insulation that wrapped the boilers of the power stations. It built, in a very literal sense, large portions of the physical country that Australians lived in during the post-war decades. And it knew for much of that time what the building material was doing to the people who made it and lived inside it and breathed its dust. The fibro house on the street in Wentworthville is still standing. The people who built it are mostly gone. The company that sold them the materials is headquartered in Chicago and has not manufactured asbestos for nearly 40 years. What does a country owe to the people it built itself upon? And what does it mean when the answer arrives too late? The asbestos is still in the walls. The dust, once breathed, does not leave. And somewhere in Australia today, a person who has never heard of the Camellia factory or the MRCF or the Jackson inquiry is being told, in a consulting room, that the mesothelioma has been confirmed and that the prognosis is what it has always been. The factory is gone. The dying is not finished.